Popes. You love them, really. They're the big daddies of Christianity. They are holy, kind, and they are great at kissing babies. I mean children. Hi, hello, and welcome. My name is Ben Has Read. I hope you are having a wonderful day. And if you end up enjoying this video, you could, leave a like, subscribe, maybe. On another note, I chose the exact worst time to film this video, as there is a storm going on right now, so the sound might be a little off, maybe like a flash of light from lightning or whatever, and there might be a bit of rain, background noise. I should probably just film another time, but I don't want to do that, so here I am. In all seriousness though, popes are known as being the face of Catholicism throughout the world, and they're supposed to abide by a certain set of moral standards. You might look to Pope Francis as an example of this. I originally planned to make this video about just one pope. Maybe he forgot to say mass one time, or he spent a little bit too much money on the papal gown. But I've actually found not one, but 8 terrible popes. They're the lowest of the low. The very last people that you would expect to be on the highest seat of Catholicism. And yet, in their time, they ruled over indescribable power, and practically ruled the entire Christian world. We'll start off with a pope who kicked off one of the most significant events in papal history, the Western Schism. This split the papacy between Avignon in France, and of course, Rome. This schism ended up sowing the seeds of distrust, which arguably led to the rise of the Protestants. I am, of course, referring to Pope Urban VI. He was so disliked by his own cardinals that they proclaimed a new pope in France and immediately excommunicated Urban. The only problem with this plan is that Urban was still pope in Rome, and he refused to give up power. As a result, he was dubbed the Antichrist by his enemies. This is, and I cannot say this enough, a pope. And this then resulted in the Western Schism, essentially being a spiritual and verbal smackdown taking course over about 100 years. You might be saying to yourself right now, but Ben, he doesn't sound so bad, he hasn't done anything wrong, it's the other pope's fault, you should make a video about him. And to that I say, shut up and you sound stupid. But it's okay, because I'm here to help, so you should subscribe. Urban also went to war with some pretty unimportant people, and he ended up being sieged for several months with some of his cardinals. Urban then escaped, but those very same cardinals that he was holed up with for months on end decided to revolt against him. He really has a terrible track record with cardinals. Urban then remembered what had happened to the last set of cardinals who had revolted, and so he had all of them imprisoned, tortured, and put to death. Remarkably, the holiest of men, in the middle of his cardinals being brutally tortured, he said that their screams were not loud enough. Not such a great man now, is he? Our second pope of the day, Stephen VI, was terrible for a completely different reason. He ruled for just 1 year, and the reason for that will become pretty clear as we go along. Stephen had a bit of a grudge, some anger, if you will, for his immediate predecessor, Pope Formosus. He disagreed with his policies, his politics, and I guess just him as a guy, I don't know. In fact, Stephen hated Formosus so much that he had him put on trial. You might be confused as to how a dead person could be put on trial, but don't worry, Stephen thought of that. He had the previous pope's rotting body dug up, dressed in full papal gear, and sat on the papal throne. And he then forced a group of clergymen to be the court, and I mean forced. Unsurprisingly, Formosus lost the trial, was stripped of all of his papal gear and titles. As well as having 3 of his fingers cut off, his body was then wrapped in carpet and thrown into a river. This, rightfully so, kicked off quite a bit of outrage in the Catholic world, and eventually it ended up in Stephen being imprisoned and strangled to death the very same summer. The reason that Stephen was actually one of the worst popes was his legacy, his very controversial legacy. Following Stephen's death, the next pope re-canonised Formosus and got rid of Stephen. And then the next pope reversed what the previous pope had done to reverse what Stephen had done about Formosus. And then the next pope, alright, you get the idea. This went on for about 100 years or so, being one of the most petty things I have ever heard of. All of this cements Stephen VI as one of the worst popes. Just quickly, I would like you all to imagine the Pope, the religious figure. Now imagine a 12-year-old as the Pope, growing up as the Pope. It probably wouldn't go too well. Luckily, we have an example of exactly this. Funny how things work out. And this was in Pope Benedict IX. Now, Benedict wasn't very well liked as a pope. In fact, there were several big no-nos that he committed during his time in power, which led to somebody saying, "A demon from hell, in the disguise of a priest, occupied the chair of Peter, and profaned the sacred mysteries of religion by his insolent courses." Imagine being so hated as a pope that you were called a literal demon. Benedict was rumoured to have been primarily gay, which immediately set people against him, and so they may have made up certain charges in order to make him seem worse than he actually was. That being said, Benedict would reportedly host mass orgies, including all sorts of people, as well as animals. This is actually a really common theme of popes, but more on that later. As a result of the hatred towards him, he was driven out of Rome by an anti-pope, and so ended his first term as pope. You heard me right. First term. Because Benedict wasn't one to give up so easily, he soon returned and he took back the papacy by force, proving that he valued the spiritual title, learning much in his time away, and proving to be a better man and spiritual leader for the people. Resigning a month later because he wanted to marry his cousin, and in the process selling the title of Pope to his godfather, which was a crime. A little while later he got dumped, and he decided that he wanted to be Pope again, waltzing into Rome and just kind of taking it. But by this point there were 3 different popes: Benedict, his godfather, and some other guy that just kind of showed up. So something had to be done. King Henry III of Germany hosted a council and he forced all 3 of the popes to resign, meaning that Benedict lived the rest of his life in obscurity. Some say he never gave up his hope of becoming pope for the 4th time, but ultimately he was never heard from again. Now we have Pope Sixtus IV. Now, Sixtus is a mixed bag, because he's known for ushering in the Renaissance, as well as personally sponsoring the Sistine Chapel. Therefore, his reign is often seen through rose-tinted glasses. But really, that's all the good he did. And I mean literally all of it. Everything else he did was terrible. Sixtus was a big family man, in more ways than one. For example, during his reign, 6 of his nephews magically became cardinals. Of course, they got that title through hard work and dedication, and years of studying. Oh, they got it because their uncle was the Pope? Got it. He also had a bit of a thing for women, fathering 6 children, one of which was with his sister. I told you he was a big family man. He was also a massive hypocrite. Remember, he had so many children and so many mistresses, and yet he created a church tax on prostitution, and he charged other church members for having mistresses. His reign also saw the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, which he helped to create, as well as his refusal to condemn slavery, which is enough to condemn him on its own. Next, we have Paul IV. When I say there is nothing redeeming about this man, I truly mean it. Usually, when there's a bad pope, you still get some people who support them, some members of the public who are diehard stans, if you will. With Paul, that isn't the case. He was so hated that whilst on his deathbed, mass riots broke out in the streets because they wanted to completely destroy any trace of him. Before I get into that though, you should really know why he's so terrible. When I say that Paul's reign eerily reflected events that happened not so long ago, I really mean it. See if you can guess what I'm talking about as we go along. Paul was an anti-Semite. He absolutely despised Jewish people. He saw them as truly lesser to him in every single way. He believed that Jewish people worsened Rome, and so he stopped them from being in Rome. And I don't mean he kicked them out. That would be way too easy. Instead, he rounded up all of the Jewish people in Rome and walled them into a tiny section of the city. This kept them completely trapped and essentially in a prison. Also, they had to wear bright yellow hats at all times to mark them as being Jewish. Finally, the Roman people were constantly goaded by Paul into treating Jewish people as lesser, and constantly would have anyone who disagreed with him imprisoned or dealt with. Unfortunately, this was not why Paul was so disliked. It should have been, but Paul's propaganda was effective enough that the Jewish ghetto, as it was known, lasted for another 300 years until the fall of the Papal States. No, the people hated him because he started a war. So much so did they hate him because of this, that immediately after his death, a crowd of people pulled down a statue of him, put it on trial, beheaded it, and had it thrown into the river. The rioters then broke into various jails, freeing over 400 prisoners, attacking churches and church officials, and finally completely dismantling any trace of the family that Paul belonged to. The crowd even created a short poem dedicated to him. Paul was despicable, so much so that I have not and will not joke about him. He is truly one of the worst popes and worst people that I have ever heard of. It doesn't get any better now, because now we are talking about Pope Boniface VIII. I only need to say one quote from Pope Boniface for you to completely understand why he's on this list. He once declared that sleeping with young boys was no more problematic than rubbing one's hands together. That's right, an open file was Pope. Frankly, the stereotype of Catholicism being rife with pedophilia is once again being proven to be true by none other than a Pope. But no, that was not the only thing that made Boniface terrible. He was also known for acting like a spoiled brat, once throwing dust in the eyes of an archbishop kneeled in prayer, and also kicking an envoy in the face. He also once had the population of Palestrina, numbering in the thousands, completely massacred, because he didn't like them very much, before immediately having sex with a married woman and her daughter in celebration. Yeah, not a great pope. It's no surprise that in Dante's Inferno, Boniface makes quite the appearance. Anyways, now we move on to my favourite person on the list. Not favourite as in I like who he was because he was a piece of shit, but favourite because his story is completely bonkers. Quite possibly the least Christian person to have ever existed. John XII exploded onto the scene just 18 years old, due to his almost prodigal level of devotion and understanding of Christianity. Oh? What was that? Oh, a part of his family currently in charge of Rome, and so forced everybody to make him Pope. Makes sense. Being an 18-year-old, John wasn't exactly mature, to say the least. He was a big fan of everything, well, not Christian. He hunted constantly, despite Catholicism outright banning it, and he also consistently sold titles to the highest bidder. A crime, by the way, in a hilarious turn of events, ordaining a 10-year-old as a bishop. Also once ordaining a deacon in horse stables, when it should be done in a church. Most importantly, he turned the papal palace into a literal brothel for him and his friends to enjoy. It's safe to say that by the end of his time in power, most of the papacy's money had been spent, which ended up causing crisis after crisis, but John didn't care. He was too busy having a good time with everything that moved. And I mean everything. Nothing would stop him. Nothing as trivial as marriage or family for that. In fact, he slept with all of his nieces and sisters. When a subdeacon of his called John immature and said that he needed to do a little bit better of a job, what did John do? Why, he had the man castrated and executed, of course. John also had other vices. He drank quite heavily, and he also liked to gamble. But it wasn't just in the act that John disobeyed Christianity. He would reportedly always toast the devil when he drank. The Pope toasted the devil. I'm just going to let that one sink in. He would also only ever pray to the pagan gods when he gambled. He is literally the least Christian man I have ever heard of, and he was the Pope. John faced rebellion after rebellion, war after war, and yet he always managed to cling to power, until one day he was finally killed doing what he loved, sleeping with a married woman. There are a few different stories around his death. One was that he had a stroke mid-stroke, another was that he had a heart attack mid-tap, and finally, and my favourite one, he was caught by the woman's husband and promptly thrown out of a window. A fantastic end to a fascinating man. Last but most certainly not least, we have a man who is always mentioned in any discussions about the worst pope, facing pretty stiff competition. I am, of course, talking about Alexander VI, also known as the corrupt pope. Now, to immediately show how bad Alexander was truly going to be, I need simply to say who his family were. The Borgias. Yes, those Borgias. You know, the ones from the horrible history song? The Borgia family. Da-da-da-dun. Da-da-da-dun. For those of you who don't know, the Borgias were one of those families that pops up throughout history that amass such ridiculous levels of power and wealth. Some other examples of this are the Medici family and the Habsburgs. To put into perspective how powerful the Borgias were, Alexander was not even the first pope from their family. In fact, it was his uncle, the Pope, who gave Alexander a cardinal position in the first place. Once Alexander decided that he wanted a crack at the big job, did he put in the work? No, of course not. He just paid everyone off until he got in power. Corruption. Ticking all the boxes today. Now, another box that Alexander ticked was his love for women, fathering 7 children, all with married women, as well as appointing 10 of his family members to be cardinals. Oh, Alexander, you take after the others. Now, what do you do when your family is insanely rich, controls indescribable power, and presides over one of the largest religions in the world? Why, you make more money, of course. And make money, Alexander did, selling so many church titles to random people. Still a crime. People really didn't like this, but unlike the other popes who didn't have the means to quiet the negative voices, Alexander simply paid anybody off who had anything bad to say about him. Another thing that Alexander was known for was his parties, but these were not normal parties. In fact, they were massive gatherings. So famous were these gatherings that many of them have names. One of these gatherings was known as the Joust of Whores, or the Banquet of Chestnuts. Within this gathering, Alexander paid around 50 prostitutes to stand around and dance whilst him and his family, yes family, ate their food. Once they had finished eating, the family had chestnuts strewn all around the floor and told the lovely woman to strip and walk around on all fours, picking up the chestnuts with their mouths, like horses. Remember that, horses. Then, because this was a gathering, Alexander of course made a bet with his family on who could have relations with the most women, who were still pretending to be horses. Speaking of horses, just a few days later, Alexander invited his sister onto the balcony. Yes, this sister was in fact at the banquet. Alexander had called her there in order to watch horses having relations. Violently. This wasn't just a one-time thing for Alexander. In fact, he seemed to have a bit of an obsession with watching horses get it on. In fact, he was so into this that he once paid for hundreds of horses to be placed inside his palace gardens, so that the fun would never stop. Alexander is known for quite possibly being the most corrupt pope ever. But I think all of the popes that we have mentioned today have reserved for themselves a special place in hell, each being uniquely terrible in so many different ways. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please consider subscribing, as it would really help me out. And lastly, if there is one thing to take from this video, then it's to ask any of your family members who work in the church to make you pope. You never know, it could work. That is all from me. Until I see you next, bye bye.